If we want to understand the nature of war, we need to understand human nature. And to understand that, we need to understand how the human brain works. Today, neuroscientist Nicholas Wright joins us to talk about his work on how brains shape the conduct of war and how war has shaped our brains. Let's get into it.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
We continue to face a grave situation in Iran.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
Hi, I'm Aaron McLean. Thanks for joining School of War. I am delighted to welcome to the show today Dr. Nicholas Wright. He's a neuroscientist. He's an advisor to the Pentagon's Joint Staff. He researches the brain technology and security at University College London, and he is the author, most recently, of Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining School of War.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for having me on.
How does one become a brain scientist?
I didn't even go through the typical route of becoming a brain scientist. So I was a neurology doctor. So I was a doctor. I did a medical degree, and then I did internal medicine and so on. And then I specialised in neurology. So that's treating patients with neurological conditions. And I became fascinated by the brain. I mean, I've been fascinated by it for many years before as well. And then I ended up doing a PhD and more research using things like functional brain imaging, so that's brain scanning, to look at how people make decisions. And that is how I published a variety of papers and did lots of, analysis and all the rest of it. And that's how I became a neuroscientist.
Tell me about the state of neuroscience today. And what I mean by that, admittedly very broad question, is I have a prejudice that probably stems from things that I read when I was very young that I've never circled back on, that we've come to know a lot about the human body in the last few hundred years of medical science. We kind of know how the heart works, kind of know how the lungs work, etc., fairly mechanical stuff, but that the brain remains tremendously mysterious even today. And there's all this talk about artificial intelligence and how to mimic intelligence with machines and things like that, whereas my prejudice against, again, sort of learned at an early age and never actually circled back upon, certainly not with anyone like yourself who's in a position to state things authoritatively, is that we don't even really know what intelligence is. So how are we doing, Nick?
Well, the great thing you'd be pleased to hear is if you got 5 academics in a room, they'd give you 17 different definitions of intelligence. So there is nothing I can say that is going to be completely satisfying. But what I would say is that we have learned an enormous amount. So if you think, for example, you talked about learning about the body, but we didn't really even know how cells worked. We didn't know about evolution until the mid-19th century. These are pretty what we now think is pretty fundamental aspects of biology, or what a lot of people would. How did we get our ideas about the brain? You are absolutely correct. It's been a long, slow process. So, you talk about the heart, and we know a lot about the heart, but we could only really understand how the heart worked once we had good microscopes that could look at the heart properly and stain the heart properly, stain the cells in the heart to reanalyze it. Exactly the same with the brain. In the late 19th century, there were remarkable new technologies for looking at brain cells, right? But the really big turning point happened in 1943, around then, when we started coming up with new ideas about how the brain worked, around how we don't just perceive the world like a passive television set in our brains or our minds. What we do is we use a model of the world. We carry around models of the world with us, and we use those models. Like literally, it can be physical models of the world around you, for example, that we carry around in our hippocampus. It's not literally a model of, it's not metaphorically a model of the world. We carry around a physical model of the physical world that we map out in our hippocampus, which is a brain region. So we have these models, and that was really a big turning point. And over the subsequent, 8 decades, we've added an enormous amount more. And there's not one simple technology that's given us a lot more knowledge. It's many different technologies that work together. Things like genetics, you can switch different cells on and off in rodents or fruit flies is something they often look at. And in humans, we can look at patients who have parts of their brains missing through, a stroke or a tumor or some rare condition. We can actually temporarily lesion parts of a brain. So some experiments I've done. You can apply magnetic pulses through the skull, which lesion parts of the brain, stop parts of the brain working. Then you can see how the brain works when part of it's missing. And you can do brain scanning. So that's things like looking at what parts of the brain are active when people are doing different tasks. And so we put all of these types of technologies together, and they're very powerful. And just to illustrate the kinds of ideas that come out of it, both last year's Nobel Prizes in AI, they were both strongly linked to my research institute in London, which is in Queen's Square, which is part of sort of UCL, University College London. And Demis Hassabis, for example, he won. He did AlphaGo, which you're probably familiar with, and beat the world's Go champion. He led that team, and is the lead researcher at DeepMind and set up DeepMind. And he and I shared an office for a little while whilst he was finishing his PhD and I started mine. And he was researching the brain, and he was researching imagination. He was looking at the hippocampus, that area I talked about that was important for imagination, and it's also very important for memory. And we use those memories. Why do we have memories? We have memories not to make some, veridical history of the past. We have memories to help us navigate the future. And so his PhD was about how do humans imagine things, right? And he was looking specifically at how the hippocampus did that. And those sorts of ideas and lots of others from neuroscience have been central to the advances we see in AI.
Could you give us a tour of the brain and its parts, just briefly, summary tour?
Yeah.
Highlighting the things that you think are of most interest to people who are mostly concerned with military matters.
Yeah. So I'll start down at the brain stem, which is right down at the very base of the brain. And the brain stem is very important for things like pain. So, and this helps illustrate kind of a lot of the reason why we have a brain. So why do you, Aaron, have a brain? You have a brain so that to link senses coming in, right, and link that to actions that you can take that help you achieve your goals. Those goals might be staying alive or reproducing or whatever it might be. Right, that's why you have a brain. That's why a mouse has a brain. That's why a fruit fly has a brain. So down at the brainstem, we see things like pain. So pain is a tissue alert response. And say, for example, you're a Spitfire pilot and you're hit by a bullet. Right? When people are actually hit by bullets, often they describe it as like a prodding finger or being hit by a lump of mud. Right? If you're a Spitfire pilot hit by a bullet, your model can sit there and it can turn down that pain. Right? So you're not immediately just going, ow, and can't do anything. They can then think, well, what should I be doing here? Should I be, warning my comrades? Should I be, trying to take that German bomber? Should I be trying to head back to base? Should I be bailing out? Whatever, right? So the model can sit there and it can help us. It can sit between sensation and action and help us choose from a repertoire of different responses. So that's just an illustration, but that's right down at the base of the brain. As you move up, you get to things like that work with emotions, things like fear or anger, and they're really important for giving us ways to respond quickly in very uncertain environments. And you can't, as I said before, fear is useful. You can't do away with fear. Then we keep moving further up, and we get to brain areas that help us navigate, for example. And then we go on to what kind of people think of as the brain, like the sort of the big bit on the outside. That's the fancy real estate, right? That's the super fancy stuff. That's what you'd be paying the big money for. This big bit of the brain. And there again, you've got big areas that are about sensation and big areas that are about taking actions, right? So if you look at the areas of sensation, for example, these like vision. So a good chunk of everything you eat, a few percent of everything you eat, the energy goes towards just your brain processing visual information, right? Every time you eat a sandwich, good bite of that sandwich is just there because you have a giant visual cortex, and it is very costly energetically to feed that visual cortex. Now, how does that visual cortex work? So it works through using, now you get too much information in through your eyes ever to just process like that information like on a passive TV set in the brain. So the way your visual perception works, for example, it's the same for all perception, but visual perception, I'll just use it as an example. The way your visual perception works is you perceive a model of the world, right? And that model of the world, it's an actively generated model. It's a created model. So to give you an example, I'm looking at your nose, but then around you, I can see blue sky. I can see lots of things. But actually, your retina, my retina, only has color, good receptors for color and fine detail right in the center. So everything else should be seen colorless and blurry around the center of your face, but it doesn't. I'm seeing lots of colors. And that's because what I'm actually seeing, I'm perceiving as a model of the world. Now, that model of the world is generated by my expectations about the world, right? By what I expect to see, right? It's generated like literally, it's like generative AI. It's a generative model. So, generative models are not new for neuroscience. It's literally a generative model. I'm generating things, generating what I'm seeing. And then it's just updated using sensory information coming in that can update it. Now, what does that mean, for example, for military people? That means that whatever technologies we use, messing around with people's expectations and can always trick them, right? And so, I give lots of examples of camouflage, cheating, communication, confusion. You see this with Israel having to fight in a city of rubble, right? Which is what the Russians did to the Germans at Stalingrad. These things will always be part of the thing. Reconnaissance will always be crucial because you need better updating, right? And people often don't think enough about that. Now, we then get what sits between sensation and action, right? So that's that, and we have amazing ways of making actions. What sits between sensation and action? That's thinking, right? We could just call that, because colloquially, we can just call that thinking. And so we have large areas of the sort of fancy real estate that sit between sensation and action, and they're for thinking. So what type of thinking? It can be, for example, I have a model in my brain of you, and I have a model in my brain of what you think of me, and I have a model, and I have a wonderful model for thinking about others' intentions, right? I have incredible brain capacity for that. So do you, right? And again, this is very energetically expensive. A good bit of sandwich that you eat goes towards fueling that model you have, your ability to mentalize, to have theories of what other people's intentions are. And we can exploit those. And I'll just come to the last part. So again, we have amazing models for planning in the future, right? And we're very good at planning. And the models we have for planning are, they have to be flawed because, we have to deal with a complex world and all the rest of it. But I'll just say one last thing, which is about, and I think this is really important for people who work in the military. And I've written about this for the Pentagon and for a number of years and done lots of things on this. And this is our thinking about thinking. This involves the frontal pole, this bit that's really most distinctively human right at the front of the brain. That bit of the brain is very important for thinking about thinking, right? You, for example, Aaron, now you can make a decision about what it is that you see in front of you, for example, or what it is that you think about something. You can then interrogate your own thoughts and ask yourself, well, how certain am I of that, right? How certain am I that the next guest I want to have on is some random British neuroscientist, right? Or whatever it might be. You can do that. You can interrogate your own thoughts, this metacognition, this thinking about thinking. And that is really important. So it was actually essential. So I'm sure you've read The Soldier and the State by Huntington. And one of the key things that he talks about there is why were the Prussians better than the French in the Franco-Prussian War? It was that they really fostered this idea of reflection, the reflective officer. They went on lots of staff rides, thought through lots of things, reflected on their own ideas, right? The Kriegspiel, all of this stuff was about reflecting on what they thought and thinking, and that really helped them. And more broadly, self-reflection is central to wisdom and wiser choices. What was the point of the Office of Net Assessment? It may still exist, I don't know. Obviously, it's complicated.
It's coming back.
Okay, it never went away. It was always there. It was recessed.
It was always there in our hearts, and now it's coming back out.
So obviously, what's the point of the Office of Net Assessment? It was partly about thinking about red, but in the context of blue. It was thinking about the other, but in thinking about that in the context of the self. Right? There was an important element of self-reflection. I'm looking out at Washington Monument. Why did Washington argue for a Senate? He argued for the Senate, so it was a reflective chamber. right? He literally, there's this wonderful, sadly probably apocryphal exchange where he basically says that's the point of the Senate is for reflection, to pour the tea into the saucer so it cools it and you can have a think about it, right?
That's working out great.
Well, I mean, you're there. It's all right. It's not literally a hellscape behind you. It looks really nice. So
You're right.
just to say, we can
that was
use
cynical of me. That was cynical.
and we can use this metacognition, and that is really crucial. And you're probably not far off the Pentagon. I was in the Pentagon, a few weeks ago, and those officers need the ability to reflect, to decide what types of actions they should or should not be taking, to think how sure they are about what it is that they're doing, and that's going to be really important. How confident they are. All leaders need to think about confidence. And those are all the types of things. There's not one part of the brain that matters. We need to think across the whole of the brain, and every part of the brain is important. I would say that, wouldn't I? Every part of the brain is important, but all of them have lessons that we can apply in the military, but also our everyday lives and in politics and everywhere else.
That was a really interesting tour. So from the animalistic brain stem all the way up to sort of paraphilosophical, or maybe just actually philosophical, or
It is
strategical, the front parts of the brain, and everything in between. The notion of models that your work emphasizes, and that you keep circling back on here in our conversation. How does a model like the ones you're talking about actually form? So you've made reference to you and I have formed, in fairly hasty fashion on limited information models of each other. As we're just meeting each other for the first time and learning of each other's existences in recent weeks. Presumably, I've grew up in Northern Virginia and later came back to it and lived there now. Presumably, I have a model of Northern Virginia in my head. How did that happen? How did these models actually coalesce?
So, I mean, a lot of the models we have, for example, you and I will both have physical model. I lived in Washington, and you and I both have literally in there a physical model of Washington DC, a map, right, of the terrain, and it's linked to the terrain literally to things like the Washington Monument, landmarks, right, help us anchor our model of the world, right, which is in there, which is then linked to reality, right, and how do we learn that? So the most classic example that if you have read any popular neuroscience book, you will probably have read this, but it happened to be done in my lab in London, again at Queen Square in London, by a lady who sadly passed away very recently, Eleanor Maguire. And she did a wonderful set of studies where she looked at London black cab drivers, right, London taxi drivers, who have to do something called the knowledge, which is where they have to basically learn how to get essentially anywhere in London just purely from memory. And she compared them, and she compared people who passed the knowledge exam to those who didn't pass the knowledge exam. She compared black cab drivers to bus drivers who spend their days driving, but they don't have to remember where they're going really beyond the basics. The gist is learning the knowledge changes the structure of your brain in the part of the brain in the hippocampus that is particularly involved in navigation, right? And that is a very robust finding. So when we learn, it changes the structure of our brain. If I teach you I don't know if you juggle, but if you don't juggle, I teach you to juggle. I can show brain changes if I scan your brain before and after, right? So we have an amazingly plastic brain, but a lot of the basics have to just be in there. For example, you have a visual cortex that is broadly the same as my visual cortex. You have maps in your hippocampus, and it's broadly going to be roughly the same because we're both humans. It's built on the same template. So how do our models form? I'd say one of the most interesting things, and this actually relates a little bit to what George C. Marshall did with his Fort Benning revolution. So he reduced the class sizes, so people had to teach more, right? So people then learnt more in smaller classes, but then they had to teach, right? So much of what we do as humans, right, I think I'm incredibly clever because I can do things like hammering nails into pieces of wood and whatever, right? But actually, I don't know, I use this example, but I had to teach my kids a few years ago how to hammer nails into pieces of wood. And I'm right-handed, and both my kids are left-handed. Right? And I had to then use my non-dominant hand to hammer it. It's actually a lot harder than it looks. And things like hammering nails into pieces of wood is actually quite difficult. It's something that your parents or other people will have taught you how to do. So much of what we take for granted is actually stuff that's taught. Like we can type, we can read, we can write, we can do all these things. we get these through learning from others who teach us. And what's remarkable is there's this spiral of learning and teaching that's really crucial. One of the key ways we humans get our models of the world is through this learning and teaching spiral. Now, we are the only primates that teach. No other primates teach. Other primates learn, but no other primates teach. So chimps, for example, they can learn, they can observe their mother cracking stones with cracking nuts with a stone or something, but the mother won't actually expend time and energy teaching. We are amazingly good at teaching. And in addition to that, we are incredibly avid social learners. So we will carry on learning about social stuff, right? Learning from other humans, even we'll carry on doing things, even when a chimp would go, well, this is a waste of time. And they've created all these clever experiments where humans carry on doing all these superstitious movements with puzzle boxes and all sorts of stuff when they shouldn't, right? So teaching and learning is crucial for how we form models of the world. And I'll just give you one last example, which is really crucial, and it's something I'm doing literally right now, which is language. So how do we, again, something that we can do that no other primates can do, how do we form groups of more than a couple of hundred individuals that are coherent? Right? No other primate can do that. None at all. So people talk about societies falling apart, and they say that's remarkable. The remarkable thing is we can have any societies that function at all. Right? Because no other primate can even get to the level of a tribe. That's, some hundreds or thousands of people together. No other primate can do that, and we can do that. So how do we do that? So one of the ways we do that is we learn, we create humans who have identities that are similar enough that they can act coherently together. I'm sure you went through this in your military training and growing up in Virginia and working in think tanks and all of this stuff, right? We create humans whose identities are similar enough that they can work together. They can work together as part of a coherent group. And that is intimately linked in a spiral with culture. So culture here is just a set of rules about how things are done around here. So at the Hudson Institute or whatever, there'll be a culture, right? In the military, there is a military culture. The US military has a culture. How things are done around here. Culture helps create the identities. The identities help create the culture. And that spirals to change us, and we are plastic. Our ideas change about who we are and what we're part of. And that, for example, is another way that we can create these groups that no others can, and that our models are formed that help us answer, for example, the question, who am I? Like if you have to answer the question, who am I? Like a lot of that would come from the cultures which you're a part, and it's now formed part of your identity. And then you, in turn, are forming your identity is such that you now form part of that culture. So our models are very plastic. They're really quite remarkable, and they do change throughout our lives. But a lot of them is, a lot of it is inbuilt as to how we can achieve these remarkable feats of learning and changing of our models.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and your point about teaching in particular is fascinating. It speaks to the existence of this front part of the brain, as you were speaking about, as sort of the most characteristically human part of the brain. So we, unlike the other primates, as you say, we're sort of able to think about the things that we're doing, and so go one step beyond just letting our young or letting whoever imitate us and actually break it down. We can analyze our own actions and explain in a way that is beyond animal capacity. But
can I introduce one interesting? That is what everybody thought until about 20 years ago, when they discovered some other animals that do teach.
Oh, not primates, non-primate.
So
animals.
It's genuinely really interesting. So this tells you something again about humans, right? So another animal that teaches is meerkats. You're probably familiar with meerkats. Those very clever little mongoose-like type guys. So meerkats have to eat dangerous prey, right? They eat, for example, scorpions. So meerkats have to teach young meerkats how to eat scorpions, because scorpions are just dangerous, right? So what they do is initially they'll bring like a dead scorpion, right, for really young meerkats. Then a bit later they will bring a scorpion with the tail, with the stinger nipped off. And then finally the meerkat has learnt enough about scorpions that they can tackle a whole scorpion. Now, they're not as good at teaching. We are so remarkable at teaching. The meerkats do that based on the age of the meerkat pups. They don't do it based on what they think others know. So you're absolutely right. We can do it orders of magnitude better than they can. But the key thing is it helps us do things that involve being smart, because meerkats are obviously smart, and doing things that are potentially very dangerous, like hunting a mammoth or whatever.
Well, it's fascinating. I think the basic point I was going to make remains, though. Well, no. It's totally fascinating. But for all of our justified preoccupation with these semi-unique, or at least uniquely well-developed frontal capacities for analysis, explanation, reflection, etc. Too much emphasis on all of that distracts from how, in other ways, we are quite basic or animalistic. And we are quite, I mean, this is something that Plato was onto a long time ago, right? That we are governed by these models, which is to say we're governed by these images, this world of images of things that we live within. And it's cool, and it makes us, it's made everything possible that we have this last, whatever percentage of capacity that is rare, virtually non-existent, is quite rare amongst other animals. But still the images govern us. And in the context of warfare, what this allows us to do is the trickery that you emphasize in your book. So one example that you speak about in the book is Patton's fake army before the invasion of Normandy in 1944. Hitler in particular, but a lot of the Germans, they look at the map of the British and French coasts, and it's just sort of obvious that the invasion is going to come at Calais. It'd be difficult and sort of self-defeating to go elsewhere. Calais is the obvious place. They're probably going to come at Calais. So what do? We lean into it. We lean into it elaborately, and give all kinds of indications and information that that's where we're going to go. All to create. A kind of over-reliance on these models that are going to, in the end, give us major advantages. Because of course we're not going to Calais. We're going to Normandy. It's manipulating the sort of animalistic parts of others' brains through our superior reflection, and hoping that their reflective capacities are going to be a step behind, that they're going to be kind of governed by their image worlds and their model worlds.
Yeah, I mean, outthinking your adversary has very often been an advantage in war. And I think that's the thing. So we need all of the different parts. For example, the will to fight, right, and the will to fight aggressively, that is only partly to do with our more sophisticated, fancy brain regions that you're talking about there, to do with reflection and so on. It's partly to do with that, but a lot of it is things like, controlling fear, harnessing fear, harnessing anger, training, right? A lot of that is crucial for those types of things. On the other hand, outthinking your adversary has always been crucial as well. Sun Tzu is a lot of what he talks a lot about more basic stuff, but a lot of what he talks about is trying to outthink the enemy, right? And we can become better at that. So I think, again, from a military perspective, I remember, I don't know if you know Michael Howard, who was a military historian, Michael Howard, and he talks about what was the biggest military innovation in the 19th century. He doesn't focus on technologies. What he focused on was the Prussian, which then became German General Staff. And the idea was that basically they were beaten. They thought they had the best army in Europe, right? And then they were beaten by Napoleon at Jena Auerstadt. And they went away and they had to think, oh God, how are we going to beat this guy? He's really good. Because he was a genius. He was a military genius. So what they did is they built, Clausewitz, but also there was some in the civilian world as well. I'd love to have gone into this in the book, but I just couldn't do it. They built a system for turning a relatively normal, intelligent person into a really good decision maker. They turned that into a process of scientific administration and planning. And they then steamrolled everybody. And I work at the Joint Staff, right? I work with the Joint Staff, so I advise the Joint Staff, which is fundamentally a copy of that original model in many ways, right? We can enhance our ability to make decisions and make decisions better. And using our new knowledge of the brain, I think, will actually help us do that more effectively. It's been done in the past, and we can do it again.
The human brain evolved over a long period of time in response to all kinds of different pressures and survival imperatives. But war, as we experience it in the last couple, let's say, 1,000 years of human history, is a much more complex enterprise than what primitive man would have experienced surviving on, the savannah hundreds of thousands of years ago. And that this introduces a kind of unusual set of tensions and situations where actually our survival instincts are not particularly well positioned to help us in various strategic situations, and things get a bit scrambled. Is that fair? And talk about the kinds of pressures that made the human brain what it is, and why it prioritizes the things that it prioritizes.
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that is a reasonably accurate characterization. My research, I'm not an evolutionary scientist, I'm a brain scientist. And yes, we can frame it in terms of, throughout human history, humans and prehistory, humans faced very, life-threatening emergencies, violence, starvation, and so on. And that's why every brain is built to survive or hopefully win a fight, right? That is true, but the book is really about the brains that we have now and how all the different brain systems we have. So I start down at the brainstem and end right at the bottom of the brain and end at the frontal pole, which is the most sophisticated brain region. It's the most distinctively human brain region. And I go through many different parts of the brain, many different brain systems, and each of those brain systems can help drive us towards war. Now, there's no one simple reason why humans are driven to war. There are many reasons, many ingredients that arise from the different brain systems we have. So for your question of how do these tensions work? So you think about fear, right? So we need fear. Fear is useful, right? You need to have fear. So and that is something that you might say, well, we have these primitive fear systems from when we were on the African savannah or whatever, and now you're living in, I don't know what's behind you. Can I see the Washington Monument behind you? I'm not.
Yes,
sure.
that's Washington, D.C.
Yeah. You're living in modern Washington. But the thing is that actually we all need these fear systems, right? And you need them now, and you certainly need them in some parts of your life, as I've read your biography, right? And what happens if people who live in our society don't have a key part of the brain that's important for fear? So there are people who can lose a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is a small part of the brain that's very important for seeing fear in others and feeling fear yourself. And people who don't have an amygdala, it's very rare, but it can happen that people lose their amygdala. And then some of those people can lose the ability to see fear in others and feel fear themselves. And if they're living in environments that are a little bit dangerous, even a little bit dangerous, like LA, there's a famous lady who lives in LA and is studied at Caltech. And losing the ability to feel fear doesn't make her a fearless criminal who can take whatever she wants without, worrying about the consequences. What it actually means is that she becomes a victim of crime. So I would just reframe it slightly with what you were saying, is that actually all of our different brain systems are useful, and they remain useful right now, even the ones that can seem more primitive, right? Yes, once you get to our most sophisticated things like our frontal pole that helps us do thinking about our own thinking, or what can be called metacognition. Once you get up there, yes, you can see how we can now make that far more sophisticated. We can learn from those who've gone before us, and we can be far more sophisticated than they could be on the African savannah. But still, the fundamental machinery remains the same, and all of it's useful. Every part of our brain's orchestra of brain systems is useful for providing the symphony with which we all live our lives.
Let me try to be a little bit more clear about what I'm trying to drive at. So you have this, you have any number of great historical vignettes in the book that tie back to various elements of brain science and just the brain itself. One of them is the fall of France in 1940, where you discuss a kind of paralysis setting in amongst French decision makers as a consequence of the shock or the surprise that they suffered as things did not proceed as they imagined that they would, given the balance of power, like the literal balance of forces between the French and the Germans, which were more or less at parity. You could argue even advantages for the French, depending on how you ran the numbers. And yet here they are. The whole thing's just collapsing before them. And this leads to a kind of paralysis. It stems from elements of the brain that presumably, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that in some tactical evolutionary manner, or some evolutionary manner relevant in a tactical context for an individual or small groups, that paralysis presumably serves some sort of survival purpose. But as a function of decision making at a high level, proves catastrophic in the circumstances that come to pass in 1940. Is that fair? Or just tell that story of 1940 from your perspective.
So I think no, I mean, you are right. So yeah, as you say, on May the 9th, 1940, there were two armies facing each other, and the Allies at that point, so it was Britain and France. You know, a number of historians, Ernest May, for example, said that the Allies had, the defenders of France had more trained men, more guns, more tanks, more planes, and they weren't worse. They were good. Some of them were even better than the Germans, but the Germans won. What, as you say, one of the key things they did is their blitzkrieg, what became subsequently known as blitzkrieg, their ability to act incredibly fast, to think and make decisions much faster than the enemy, to really cut through the enemy, to surprise the enemy, caused, as you describe, a real paralysis. Right. So again, Ernest May, he says, if there's one feature that explains the fall of France so quickly, and it's literally within 7 weeks, Hitler's cavalry was clattering up the Champs-Elysees in a victory parade. It was the surprise. And why is surprise so important? The reason why surprise is so important is because surprise is an absolutely fundamental feature of how brains work. We need surprise. So we use models of the world to understand the world, right? We have to use models of the world. And by model here, I mean a process that links senses to actions to help us achieve our goals. That's kind of what a model of the world is. And it can be sophisticated, like the one I said, with the map of the world in it. And there are all sorts of models we have of the world. Now, how do we update our models of the world? How do we change our models of the world to keep them consistent with reality? The way we do that is where our models are constantly making predictions. They're constantly predicting how the world is going to work. And when those predictions are wrong, when there is an error in those predictions, then that prediction error, that learning signal, can help us update our models. So this is just fundamental across, essentially the whole range of our brain systems, this prediction error. And so when an event happens that is very surprising, it can cause a huge psychological impact. And you're absolutely right, we need that to learn. And I think you're right. But I would actually say, it didn't do. But and the gist is that when you have too much of it, it can cause a shock, paralysis, can prevent you from responding appropriately. Your idea that it matters, it's more useful at the tactical level is in. Thank you for. No one's asked me that question before, but I would say, he didn't do the French troops. Because one of the challenges is that the French troops who were defending the Ardennes were some of the poorly trained French troops. And the French did not train during the period of what became known as the phony war. They did not train anywhere near as hard as the Germans. And they were the less effective French troops, the less well-trained French troops. I don't think it did them a lot of good, actually, that they were paralysed by the surprise of the just sheer speed of the German blitzkrieg, any more than it necessarily helped those who, for example, French generals who literally burst into tears.
Let me clarify. So, sorry, I'm using tactical a bit loosely. I don't mean French troops in 1940 at the tactical level. I mean our distant ancestors who are dealing with dangerous animals or other small bands of people. And presumably, and I'm sorry, I'm totally out on a limb here. This is just me kind of making stuff up. So you're going to tell us what the truth is. That it's the famous fight or flight reflex, right? You either stand and fight, you run away, and if neither is possible, in the shock of the moment, there is this tendency to freeze, which I'm speculating, has some sort of evolutionary purpose that amongst if you're going to get murdered if you fight and you can't run away, playing dead or just being stock still, probably again, it's some very basic.
Rodents show freezing. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Yeah.
And so that it has some basis in the human survival instinct. But here you're seeing it play out at a sort of strategic into grand strategic level, and deeply unhelpful in that level.
So it's not just, so one thing here is that it's not just to do with fear. So freezing is kind of a fear-related response, but actually prediction errors, when you get this shock and surprise, that is across many different parts of it. That's how essentially all the parts of our brain work. So it's like the clashing of the cymbals that really dominate across the whole of the output of the orchestra. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. What I think the other thing to remember is that our systems are, we do have very effective, we need all of these different brain systems, we have very effective brain systems. So if we, I'm not going to move to the other things, I'm going to stick with fear for a bit.
Sure.
So, for example, Vladimir Putin in his so he's a man who really understands how to use fear and manipulate fear in others, right? He's literally a former KGB agent and not a very nice guy by very many different measures. And he really understands how to manipulate fear in others. He understands fear clearly. And, there was a story he's told a number of times, apparently, and it was in his sort of pseudo-autobiography, which is where he was growing up in a dilapidated Leningrad apartment block, and he chased rats with sticks. And one day he cornered the rat, and then the rat, basically, he got so close to the rat, and the rat then, turned around and attacked him. And so and then the rat was chasing me. So another response to fear response, there are many things that can happen. You can withdraw your foot from a nail when you step on it, right? That's just super quick. You can, if you're a trained person, you might learn the habit of ducking if you hear certain types of noises, if you're in a trench, say, or whatever. You also could have reflexive attacks. So depending on the distance that the enemy is with you, you might either run, or if you've got space to do that, or freeze, or you might attack, right? Which is, what Putin was eliciting in that rat. But then also we can link those fear systems, and those fear systems are also linked to, in humans in particular, to our amazing abilities to plan forwards, the much more sophisticated regions of prefrontal cortex and so on, which help us plan forwards. And we are incredibly good at planning forwards, planning enormously sophisticated understandings and projects in the world. Now, fear can also be linked to those. So that's what anxiety is, right? You may, I don't know whether you do worry about this, but you may worry about a civil war brewing, or you might worry about climate change, or you might worry about the erosion of your group's status in society, whatever it is. Fears can operate on that level too, and cause these anxieties. Anxiety is just a longer run version of fear, essentially. But the gist of it is right down there, and it actually has many different manifestations. Many of them are useful, many of them are not useful. We need to harness them as best we can. And if we can understand them better and understand ourselves better as humans, then that can help us control those emotions, harness those emotions, and understand them better in others.
I'm curious what role you would say understanding the brain better would play in the context of military training. So much training. I was lucky to participate in some fairly, what I thought at the time was pretty, and think now is pretty high quality infantry training. And a lot of it, looking back on it and sort of reflecting on it, considering your work, was about increasing at the margins, but maybe substantially at the margins if you're doing it well, resilience in the face of all kinds of pressures that you speak about in the book. So, at the very basic level, hunger, thirst, the need to, the way in which your body just doesn't work at a certain point if you don't get enough sleep. Just giving the trainees, the personnel, experience of hunger, experience of thirst, probably least of all thirst, because that's actually the most dangerous one that'll kill you the fastest. But certainly the hunger and the sleeplessness, pretty extensive experience with hunger and sleeplessness in the training, just to kind of give the trainee practice at understanding what it feels like to be in that situation, so that they're not in that situation for the first time on the battlefield. And then, of course, the emotional dimension to anything. I mean, a lot of the training is stressful and challenging, not just physically, but at kind of an emotional level and almost a moral level as well. Again, to sort of at the margins inculcate a kind of toughness, you call it courage if you want, these ways in which you're sort of pushing people to operate further out from what their normal limitations would be. If you were talking to the kinds of people who design or execute this training, what would you tell them about the brain that you think they might find most useful?
Yeah, I mean, so I do. Well, I do. I do speak to these people. So I think you're absolutely right. A lot of what you're trying to do, for example, is just to make things less unexpected. So they've done studies of people jumping out of aeroplanes. The first time a parachute jumps out of an aeroplane, you get spikes of stress hormones and all the rest of it. But then the second, third, fourth time, it's now better understood by them. It is less unexpected, and they can handle it much better. So a lot of it is exactly as you're saying, is about trying to handle things much better. Now, how can we, for example, use that kind of thing now? So one of the wonderful examples I found for the book was George C. Marshall. So I'm sure you're obviously familiar with George C. Marshall, the sort of top American commander during World War II, military officer during World War II, and subsequent secretary and so on. Most people don't know about the earlier part of his life, about 10 years before, when he was in charge of the infantry school at Fort Benning, and he was in charge of the teaching there. And what Marshall did is Marshall revolutionized the teaching at Fort Benning. And it was really quite, I think a lot of how well America did during World War II, and probably actually a lot of the things that you learned in some ways are influenced by his teaching, his ideas, what he did, what they called the Benning Revolution. And 200 future generals went through as either instructors or students during his time there. And he basically improved training because he made training more effective. And some of the ways he did that, for example, was using a lot of the supervisors were taking people back to the same types of places to do their exercises. So he was saying, no, you need to take people to novel places to do their exercises. There's another crucial thing about so making things, trying to get people to basically try and get more prediction errors, the more signals to learn from. Right? You don't want to. One of his key things was not learning how to do things perfectly, but learning how to do them well enough across a wide range of different contexts. Right? Which is something that's really important for the brain. And I think he did lots of other things I won't go into, but the gist is that if I were talking to people now, and I do, I'm like, well, what would a George C. Marshall thinking of a world war 10 years in the future? What would he be doing now, 10 years ahead of time? Right? And I think what we should be doing is using things like AI, augmented reality, to create as many different types of simulated environments as possible, so that we are really training people across a wide range of unexpected different types of scenarios that are very difficult to do, with standard training. So I think, again, we should be thinking, what would a modern day George C. Marshall be doing? He would be using the cutting edge technologies we have to revolutionize training. And yeah, it's not going to be decisive. It's going to be like a small advance, a small enhancement. But that could be a really important factor in a future conflict.
I want to close with a couple of questions about AI. And let me just ask them both, and you take them in whatever order and whatever way you like. The first is, you've laid out for us this, if you'll forgive the expression, that was model of how the brain
I love the word model
works. This model of models and how we work with them. To what extent does AI work the same way? To what extent is it different? I mean, my sort of deep-rooted suspicion is that it's actually meaningfully different, but I'd like to hear how you think about it. So that's the first question. The second question, more of a moral or political question than a science question. Your example about the London cab drivers who do the knowledge, having their brain meaningfully changed is fascinating. And it's also, in a way, concerning when we contemplate the way in which AI might affect what it means to be human in the years and generations to come. Technology has always changed what it means to be human. It sort of is what it means to be human, is we're the species that technology changes and the species that creates the technology that changes us, and that loop is us. I don't have to explain to you. And so, I'm happy that a long time ago we figured out how to cook with fire, and so our brains got big, and if we got a little bit scrawnier, well, so be it. That seems like a bargain worth making, and there have been any number of bargains like that over the years. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm a little bit worried about outsourcing my cognitive abilities. I don't fully know what that means. I grant that on some level we've been doing that for a long time now. So before we could write and take notes easily, We had to remember a lot more. We don't really remember like we used to remember a few hundred years or 600-700 years ago. So second question is, what do you think the effect of AI is going to be on us?
So I'll take the first one, which is about, well, first one first, which was about, how far does AI use these models, right, or use the similar ways that the brain uses. Now, one like slightly boring answer to that is just that there are lots of different ways that AI can work, and so it depends. So, for example, so LLMs, for example, which is obviously a big deal now, they are generative models, right? And as I said, that is literally like to some extent how your visual system works. And also just to say that, so Geoffrey Hinton, who was also at Queen's Quest, he set up the Gatsby. So he won last year's Nobel Prize. He was the other guy, not Demis Savis, Geoffrey Hinton. And he basically invented these artificial neural networks in key aspects of that. And he literally set up the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit, right, at Queen Square before he went off to Toronto. And, that's where I used to work. And he was deeply involved in how the brain worked. And a lot of his ideas were about trying to build an artificial brain. So I think if we're trying to think about how the brain works, a lot of the stuff that I talk about in the book, for example, that has permeated the way that AI works, even if most people, even in AI, don't really know that. But Geoffrey Hinton, if you listen to him, he's like, I was trying to build an electronic brain. Alan Turing, who's a famous computer scientist, he actually he may even have been in Washington, but he met with Claude Shannon, who's like one of the most famous he was known as the father of information theory. The two of them chatted during World War II about how they could create an electronic brain. They used to chat over lunch whilst they were doing code breaking type stuff or secure communications. So the ideas really are in there, right at the very heart of AI. And LLMs, for example, that a lot of where they work is inspired by these types of things and do that. But then there are a whole other set of models that were very fashionable before that, or in fact before about 2012, they were the sort of key things, which are more rules-based models. So if this, then if A, then B, whatever. It's like rules-based models. So like more. Now, the way in my opinion, the way AI is going to proceed is we're going to have enormous advances from the LLMs, which are more just let's throw loads of compute at it, loads of computing power. As I said, your brain is really expensive, right? A lot of every sandwich you eat goes to power your brain. Raw compute power is important, and it's the same with AI. But in addition to that, there are lots of things where they use models. So an example would be weather forecasting. You can do weather forecasting just using large language model type things that will basically just are quite naive, that it have a model of physics involved, and they can be quite effective. The standard way of doing weather forecasting is building giant models that use structures or models of the world about how physics works, right? Often the best thing to do is to combine those two things together, which is pretty much how our brain works. So I think all of these types of models that we talk about are going to be important for AI moving forwards, because it's going to involve, just as our brain involves multiple types of models working together in an orchestra, that's how the future of AI will be. Your second question about how, what's it going to do to us? So everyone's very worried about social media, and it's true. If you go on the tube now in London, or I did it in DC when I was there a couple of weeks ago, you look at everyone on the metro, and they're not even reading anymore. They're looking at their phones and they're looking at videos or pictures. It's like we're going into some kind of pre-literate society, where we're going to be doing whatever. People worry about that. On the other hand, book sales are actually not going down in America. And physical books are still there, right? A lot of people are going to continue doing that. Yes, are people going to be as good now at navigating as they were in the past? No. But probably if the balloon went up or whatever, we could probably work without GPS if we really needed to. I don't think that young people today are so incapable because they didn't learn how to use a compass like I did when I was a teenager, that they could not be able to navigate. And the other thing to say is I think, like Henry Kissinger wrote a piece in The Atlantic back in, I think it's about 2018, worrying about what it would mean for humanity to have like computers that know us better than we know ourselves. And my first thought, and I've stuck with it, and I've not changed my mind on this, is we are incredibly egocentric beasts. Right? Humans are so egocentric. We think we're amazing. We will always find ways to think that we are special and different and incredible and wonderful and marvelous. And that we have something profound and important to say, as I'm saying to you now with my profound and important thoughts, right? And so I'm not that worried that AI is going to make us, either inadequate in terms of capabilities or, become, it will destroy our drive or our self-belief, because that's just not how humans are. We are too egocentric and exciting and changeable for all of that.
Nicholas Wright, author of Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. It's been fascinating. This is a bit off-piste for me, at least, but I've learned a lot, and I'm really grateful to you for joining the show.
Thanks so much. It was really fun. Thank you.